Moderator for today's program. I'm one of the regular hosts of the World Affairs radio program and podcast, and the author of Latino Americans, a history of Latino migration to the United States. I'm delighted to have Paola Ramos here. She's a host and correspondent for Vice and Vice News, as well as a contributor to Telemundo News and MSNBC. Ramos was the deputy director of Hispanic media for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign and a political appointee during the Obama administration. She also served in President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. She currently lives in Brooklyn, but she's out west on a reporting trip. You can purchase her newest book at your local bookstore or online, Finding Latinx, In Search of the Voices, Redefining Latino Identity. Paola, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
I thought that 40 years as a reporter, I'd be able to say that not much surprises me anymore, though the results of the 2020 election didn't surprise me. The turnout did, and the way the Latino vote has been covered definitely did. In the endless search for novelty and edgy takes, reporters have proclaimed it, weirdly, a kind of win for Trump after he lost Latino voters by more than 2-1. And I keep reading these stories where Latino voters quote unquote, denied Joe Biden victory in this state or that state, only to read the article and find huge youth registration,
that's right,
amplified turnout, massive lopsided victories in New York and California and Georgia and Arizona. It's really strange. So I want to talk to you about that. And I also want to talk about the idea of Latinidad at all, because some of the coverage in the last 2 weeks has gone to whether you can even talk about a Latino identity or a Latino vote, because people have become so in love with slicing and dicing the population that they think there is no thing that is a Latino vote or a Latino people. And you in your book jump right into that question with both feet and take us on a tour of the whole country, an America that's happening right under people's noses. So great to talk to you right at the moment. What do you make of the election?
I mean, I'm glad that you also weren't surprised. It has been very interesting to see folks, with all these different takes, and I do think there is this obsession, right, to tell the story through Trump's lens, right? That 34% of Latinos that did end up going for Trump, and people are shocked by that. But I think it's important to remind the audience of the fact that, as you know, right, traditionally, the GOP and the Republican Party, traditionally, they typically get between 25 to 30% of that Latino vote. That's not news. I think a lot of the obsession is focused on the Cuban American vote in Miami-Dade County. Once again, Cubans are just 6% of the entire Latino population. For perspective, in a place like the Rio Grande Valley, it's the same story, right? The Valley is just 15% of the entire Texas Latino vote. And so, just for context, right, that's just one slice of the story. I think the story that I believe you may see, Ray, which is the one that I see, is when this country was asked a question, which is who are we as a nation? Is Trump's America the country that we know? White voters said yes, and Black and brown voters said no. And so Black voters, particularly Black women, led the charge in these states, and the Latinx vote was walking right along their side. And so I think, when you look at the numbers, I think in the last 6 presidential elections, the Latino voter turnout has typically been below 50%, right? Typically less than 50% of Latino eligible voters show up. This time it's projected to be between 55 and 60%, if not 70%, according to some. And so that tells you the story of how different this election was, right? The state of Arizona, which is where I am right now, to me is a perfect example of what this sort of the story of this election, where you had the younger generation of Latinos that saw folks like their parents be criminalized by people like Joe Arpaio and by legislations like SB 1070. It is a younger generation here that flipped Maricopa County, right? That is starting to choose a different type of change for themselves. And I think this story is replicated in different states, right? In Nevada, you saw a similar story, right? Nevada has one of the highest percentages of undocumented folks per capita, right? It is young Latinos who once again chose Democrats, right? You go to Wisconsin, you go to Michigan, places where they never think about us. our early voter turnout was out of the roof, right? Led by Latinas, led by young people. And so that's the story that I'm choosing to focus on, right? Yeah, I think that the numbers are telling us that young Latinos are coming out in unprecedented ways. And so that to me is more interesting than that 30% that remain fixated on Trump, which we can talk about, right, the root cause of that. But that's what I see.
The book talks a lot about that younger generation. Why Latinx? I find it's a term that does not come to me naturally, and I wonder
Why
sometimes
not?
if that's a generational thing.
No, but so I would love, so, and I think that's the conversation to be had, right? And I'm curious, why, in your eyes, and I know you're interviewing me, but in your eyes, what is it about the word that causes rejection or hesitation?
Oh no, it's not rejection as much as just it's not natural. It's not a word that's easily
Hmm.
said. It's not it doesn't come like music off the tongue, uh,
True,
either in English or in Spanish, having that X
true.
at the end of the word. So it's a change I'm still getting used to, but I have
Yeah.
absolutely no trouble with it and use it as their default term.
So I think to me, you just said it, right? You said the word Latinx isn't natural. No, it doesn't come naturally in sort of as you say it. I think that's precisely the power of the word, right? That when we think of the Latino community that we've been told exists, the natural image that emerges is a very stereotypical one, but the unnatural one is perhaps the more realistic one, which is a community that is not just folks that look like you and I, right? There are 3 million Afro-Latinos. There's over 1 million indigenous folks, and there are millions of young millennial Latinos that are proudly queer. There are Latino Muslims in this country, and so that is sort of what is the unnatural but real image of what the Latino community is. And I think that is exactly sort of the hidden power of the X, right? That it makes people feel uncomfortable, right? That it makes people feel like it is unnatural. And that to me is kind of the thesis of this book, right? It's worth digging into why people feel sort of breaking into these stereotypes of the words that Latino and Hispanic have typically given us. And the X, I think, forces you to see us in a very different way that is sort of the where our community is headed towards.
I've lived in other parts of the country, far from my hometown of Brooklyn, and that experience, and places like Los Angeles, where there aren't very many Puerto Ricans, um, well, Washington D.C., another place where there's not very many Puerto Ricans, and you know, I never had any question. People instinctively assume that there's something that binds together a Dominican in
Mhm.
Manhattan and a Puerto Rican in Hartford, Connecticut, and a Salvadoran in Houston and a Mexican in Tucson. And those same people don't have any illusions about what makes those different identities separate and distinct. But when I was welcomed and treated as a brother and
Mhm.
treated as a member of a very large extended family by people who were not Puerto Rican because they shared that assumption that there
Right.
was a something. And critically, that something sometimes remained unnamed, but
Mhm.
the assumption
Mhm.
was there that we were sort of in this thing together. And now there are people trying to make the exact opposite argument that there is nothing, that there is no people, that we are not a people.
Right. Yeah, and I think to me that's the story of that 30%, right, that continues to go, or that 35% that went to Trump, right? I think that story are people that forgot about that something, right? That were able to forget about the reason why their families and their parents came to this country in the first place, right? The reason why the immigration story is so central to who we are, right? To me, though, that 30% are people that have forgotten in a way where we come from and who we are, right? And so I think you're right. It is a moment where a lot of people are rightly so questioning if there is such a thing as a Latino community, Latinx community, if there is such a thing as a Latino vote. To me, I go back to sort of the origin of the story, right? Which is the one thing that we have in common, all of us, right? Regardless of our generation, regardless of our skin color, our sexual orientation, the one thing as Latinos that we have in common is that someone at some point in our families did come to this country to give us sort of these rights to lean into, and to search perhaps a dream that is as we're noticing these last years, a dream that perhaps wasn't so real and perhaps wasn't as dreamy as we thought. But that is why many people came to this country. And so that underlying thread, I think, is what gives me hope, and that this is a community that at the end of the day will embrace being open, right? And will embrace rights and will embrace each other. And so that's what I'm sort of committed to seeing, right? And that's sort of what I try and do in the book, that regardless of all these barriers, regardless of the ways that we are being divided, at the end of the day, if you're able to remind people of why, that one person in our family came to this country, that is a pretty like unprecedented power that we have. That gives us an openness and a way to sort of look at this country through a very different lens that I think perhaps other communities have.
Not out of sociology, not out of anthropology, just plain old muscular politics. Why would you make yourself something smaller rather than larger? I don't get it.
I mean, we can get into it. I think the power of assimilation, and the trauma that comes with our story is worth digging into, and why people would choose what they're choosing, and would choose Trumpism. I think a lot of the core of that has to do with the assimilation, which is part of our story, right? With this idea that, when you come to this country, particularly the older generations, were told, right, that in order to assimilate and to make it to that American dream, you strove for whiteness, and it was white power, and someone in our families had to turn down speaking Spanish in order to speak English, sort of had to put their head down, and had to strive to be part of the boys club, which was white, and that's real, right? That is real, and yeah.
But what's fascinating to me about this is that if you cling and say, no, I'm not Hispanic, I'm not Latino, I'm Cuban, I'm Salvadoran, I'm a Guatemalteco, you're not acknowledging that there's something that's growing up, that's being created by life in America. That's not from Puebla. That's not from Caracas. That's not from San Juan. It's a thing that couldn't grow in any of those individual places. It's an
You're
American thing.
You're absolutely right. And, it's
like
interesting
you.
when no, but that's that to me, when I've had these conversations, with that 30%, that's always the first question that I have. How do you identify? And that's always very telling. Most people say I'm American first, and within that 30%. And I've had many times, including Black Latinos, Afro-Latinos, people tell me to my face, I'm not a person of color, I'm not Latino, I'm not Hispanic, I'm not Latinx, I'm American. And so that to me says a lot, about just sort of the psychology behind this denying of who we are. But I think what's interesting, at least to me, Ray, is that with the younger generation, that younger generation, that younger voting bloc, which at the end is like more than 40%, right, of the Latino vote. When I ask them, they start the conversation saying, I'm Latino first, right? I'm Mexican first, and then I'm American. And so I think that says a lot about how people are defining what it means to be American. And when it comes to the younger generation, I think for the first time, no one else but ourselves defines what it means to be us, right? And when I look at folks like my parents and my grandparents, someone else was defining to them what it meant to be American, what it meant to be, what success meant, what dreams meant. And I think that's a big difference that I see. And you can notice that in something as simple as asking someone, how do you identify? which I think is pretty cool.
My daughter, my youngest child, rode crew, which I think of as like one of the whitest things you can do.
Completely.
That's another it's another conversation for another
My brother
day.
plays American football, so I got you.
So one year her 4 people in the boat happened to win a citywide race. And it was a great thing, a very happy moment. And they took a picture with a cup. And I looked at them and I realized that the 4 of them were Puerto Rican, Cuban, Venezuelan, and Central American. And this is a DC city high school with a mix of identities and backgrounds. They think of themselves, these 4 girls who just won in this boat, as part of a sisterhood. They don't get hung up on whose parents came from where. They say we're Latinas, and they have absolutely no hesitation, actually a lot of pride, and they're not that interested in making the distinction. Well, your father came from here and my father came from there, and
they
all
see
that.
themselves
It's
as
not
one.
useful to them. It's not useful to them, and it's not useful to their ways of finding bridges to each other to make distinctions instead of finding commonalities. And that seems a lot healthier than the opposite. I don't know.
I think so. I mean, for you, I'd be curious as a father, is that, do you see a difference between how your daughter is approaching that versus even just how you did?
Well, growing up when I did in New York, if you were Latino, you were likely Puerto Rican, because
Right. Okay.
about everybody was. Country and New York have changed a great deal in those years since I was a kid. And, I was very moved by the fact when a Mexican parent would come up and introduce his child to me on the streets of Chicago and say that, you should go to school and you should work hard in school so you can be like Mr. Ray Suarez here. He wasn't making a distinction either, saying, well, he's not like you because he's Puerto Rican. He saw me on television and said, well, here's a guy that I want my child to emulate. What was I going to say? Oh, well, sir, senor, momentico, I'm Puerto Rican. You don't want him to be like me. It was crazy. That would be crazy. And yet there are people who are very much hung up on those sorts of distinctions. And the book, much to its credit, takes us to places that are not on people's normal mental maps of Latino America, which is one of its great strengths. Thank you.
One of, as you're talking about your daughter and the way that she embraces her friends and other Latinas, I think another thing that I noticed this summer that I think is very telling of where young Latinos are, and when you contrast that, at least to our parents' generation, is also this idea of there's finally this awakening and this understanding of like Afro-Latinos too, right? And of sort of how intertwined these two communities are. And I saw that very clearly during, obviously during George Floyd's and during all the protests that we saw, and when people were taking the streets, and when they were carrying their posters. I remember being very noticing one of the main messages that many young Latinos were carrying, which was, your fight is my fight. No, and I think there is this understanding, as you're saying, right, that the Afro-Latino fight, right, and Afro-Latinos are very much part of us, right? That Blackness is very much part of what it means to be Latino. And I think I didn't see that growing up, right? I didn't see my parents even talking about race in that way. And so I think that's just another sort of dynamic that's happening among younger people, that they're embracing, race in a way that perhaps, my grandparents and my parents, and not even I ever did.
Well, I think part of that might be because the threat of being perceived and defined as non-white for earlier generations had definite and definitely problematic implications, and defined where you could live and where you could go to school and where you could apply for a job in a way that I know, thinking back to the 50s and 60s, when Puerto Ricans moved into New York, some very comfortably lived in neighborhoods that were long places of significant Black residential
Mm-hmm.
life, and some fled from those places because they were afraid that they would be
Mm.
perceived as non-white. And I see that in stuff like the story you tell of one of the leaders of the Proud Boys, who's an Afro-Cuban and has this really odd relationship to the whole idea of Americanness and whiteness,
Mm-hmm.
and where they're
Completely.
the same thing and where they're not the same thing. Tell us about him.
Yeah, so you're right. That's Enrique Dario, right? So folks know he's the chairman of the Proud Boys. Although lately I've been seeing some news where apparently now the Proud Boys are trying to push him out because I think I think at some point they sort of like cherry picked him to maybe make the case that they weren't racist because they had an Afro-Cuban that was leading the Proud Boys. But now, ever since Trump lost, he's sort of being pushed away. And you know, they're very open about why they're doing that. But anyways, but the story with Enrique, you're right. He's Afro-Cuban and he's Black Latino, and he would be the first one that would tell me that he's neither of those things, right? That he's American first. But I think part of this sort of Latinx exercise for me was instead of walking into these conversations and into these spaces with my own biases, right, and my own instinct to reject someone like Enrique, which is my instinct, and just because we fundamentally believe in completely different things. I believe, you know, a lot of the things that he does and he stands for are racist. But instead of going through that and stepping into a conversation like that, I wanted to understand why someone like him would choose that. And so the very basic conclusion that I came to is that here is an Afro-Cuban, no, in Miami, that has been forgotten and neglected by a system, and in many ways also forgotten and neglected by the two parties, right? Both by Republicans and by Democrats, right? He was perhaps too Latino to be Black, too Black to be Latino. He sort of fell in nowhere, and then comes Trump. And the best and the only explanation that I could get is when I asked him, you know, why Donald Trump? And his response was, porque habla como calle, no, because he talks like street talk. And he's like, we're the same at the end of the day. No, we both talk the same way. And so at the end of the day, it's whomever makes you feel like you belong, whoever makes you feel like you're important, no? And that was for him, Trump. And I think, you know, there's all, of course, there's all these interesting debates as to, you know, why did the Democrats lose ground with Cubans? Why did they lose ground in the Rio Grande Valley? And I think beyond the politics and the policy, and the shifting demographics, at the end of the day, it's a pretty simple question, right? Which is who made them feel like they counted, and that's all emotional. And yeah, I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I've found it a sort of simple case of wanting to be with the winners.
Mm.
He, a man like that, might perceive his long future as being better off having allies over here instead of allies over there, and
Yeah,
he made his choice. And in a way, it sort of symbolizes the choices a lot of people make. I mean, there's a
you're right.
natural reaction to the fear of being rejected, isn't there? I mean, don't stick out, try to fit in, shave off your spiky edges and your sharp corners,
Yeah,
make yourself smooth as a milkshake. You don't want to be a problem, and that's what gets you accepted.
you're right. This is reminding me one of the just a funny little anecdote. I was in Florida. I was in Miami covering the election. Of course, the story on Tuesday night, right, as Trump won Florida, and you know, he won that Cuban American vote. Miami looked crazy, right? Everyone was out in the streets. And then on Saturday, and when Joe Biden wins, one of my friends told me that a lot of the Cuban American Trump community in Hialeah, who's close to Miami, that suddenly people were like, okay, never mind, I'm with Joe Biden, right? Because he won. So it was very, but I think you're right. Literally, they were like, okay, no, vamos con los ganadores. No, we're going with the winners. And so I think you're right. At the end of the day, is they want to go with the winners. But anyways, I thought that was funny.
Are you an example in your own life, which may explain in part your easy embrace of this future that you describe in the book? Because one of your parents is Mexican, one is Cuban. You're very aware of both histories and what life is like and the world is like in both countries, and yet you're very much of here, a creation of here. That make it easier for you?
I think so. I mean, I think when I, one of the things that people come back with a lot is, oh, but the Latinx term that doesn't apply to other countries. No, that's just a very American centric term, and I think that's good criticism. But I think they're absolutely right. I think when I talk about the Latinx experience, so much of it is being told through the lens of young Latinos that grew up in this country, right? That in many ways we rejected sort of these stereotypes that our parents went through. And again, I mean, I grew up with two journalists and who worked in Spanish language media. And so my idea of what it meant to be, a Latina in this country was very different from the one that I felt like. I remember, watching the telenovelas, watching my dad in the newscast, and, watching every day what it meant to be sort of a women Latina in this country. And that's not what I felt. That's not what I wanted for myself. And, and I was able to choose a different path. Same, right? Same with my sexual orientation, and same with the sort of pathways and professions that I chose for myself, which was never a linear form, right? I bounced back and forth between things. And it's because, unlike my parents, I could do that, right? I didn't have to choose a linear pathway. I could be what I wanted to be. And of course, it was never easy. It also wasn't the hardest thing, but I think I've always felt not only like I had more choices, but that I had a responsibility to lean into them, perhaps in a way that my parents didn't.
Does time take care of some of this? I mean, the present crisis for some
Mm-hmm.
communities, the present challenges for some communities are real, and I would never minimize them. But I wonder, especially given the fact that the next census is going to count some 60 plus million Latinos in this country, whether time just takes care of some of this.
I think
Like America's going to have to get it because it has to get it.
I think so, and that's a good question. I think so. There's the inevitable reality, right, of knowing that we're headed towards a 2040 where the majority of this country will be minority, and that is inevitable. No matter how hard you try and to suppress that, no matter how hard you try and deny election results, that is where we're headed. No, we're also headed towards a reality where Congress more and more every 4 years, every 2 years is more diverse. You also that will continue to be that trajectory, and more than anything, we're headed to a reality where the younger generation of Latinos are becoming eligible voters. The majority of eligible voters now are Gen Zers and millennials. Every year at least a million of us. Just the numbers are on our side, and so I think change was slow for years, and it felt very slow. And I look at someone like my parents. Now they've been covering this for years. I mean, you've been covering this for years. Now I feel like we've been having these conversations for many years. And I do think that finally, numbers are on our side, right? And it is approaching. And one of the biggest signs that I see is even in the way that the Biden and Harris administration is attempting to center like immigration and Latinos at the center of the agenda of this new White House. No, that's pretty new. To think about the first 100 days, to think about the way that they're at least attempting to diversify this White House. I didn't even feel that under the Obama White House. And so to me, those are signs of change.
Could you be tempted to go back into political life?
I think about that a lot. I think of sort of my career in understanding where the balance of power is, no, which is of course also an immense privilege. I think, for for years I thought change was in an Obama White House, right, where I very believed and was moved by this idea of hope and change and what it meant to be a young person in the Obama and in Obama's America. I believed that, and so that's why I lived in Washington D.C. I believed in the idea of having the first female president. And so that is why I know I worked for Hillary Clinton, because that is where I thought change could occur. And now when Trump was elected, I believe that my responsibility was to be outside of politics, right? To sort of hold them accountable, to do the storytelling. And so I still think that is where my power is in this moment. That I would never, I would never put politics to a side again, because it may be the case that 2 years from now, I think that is there's more possibility there than that I have right here with the microphone. And I don't know.
For people who are watching the webinar and you're wondering, why does she have a microphone? Why does he have a microphone? Because in addition to this webinar, we're also making a radio program out of this conversation, which we urge you not only to listen to yourself, but tell your friends to listen to. Taking questions from our webinar attendees in the next few minutes. Go down to the Q&A function down at the bottom of your Zoom screen and put your questions there, and I'll put them to Paola. Other immigrant groups have come over long periods of time. In every case, there's like a big spike, a very concentrated number of years where Norwegians came or Germans came, but every group had a long period over which they came. So what you end up with is people who are still learning the language and people who were born here, people who are already somewhat acculturated, somewhat assimilated, somewhat embedded in the system, and people who are still trying to find their way. But no group has that phenomenon over the course of 2 centuries. So people whose families have been here for 6 and 7 and 10 and 12 and 15 generations, and people who got here the day before yesterday.
Right.
And it's creating something that's really unusual, but also a diversity of how to be you that's really unusual in American history as well.
Yeah, I mean, when you say that, the first group I think about of immigrants are sort of the indigenous folks and the Guatemalan and Mayan folks that I met throughout the book and through other reporting that I've done. Once again, right, for years I thought of immigration in a very singular way and siloed way. I thought of of just Spanish speaking immigrants, and then through this research and through a lot of the stories that I met, that's not the reality at all. No, there's many other barriers that immigrants are going through that I truly wasn't aware of for years. And again, and I think of what it meant to cross the border. No, if you're coming from Guatemala and you're Mayan, and you're approached by a border patrol agent or an immigration agent, and they talk to you in Spanish because they think you're going to respond in Spanish, and yet you don't speak Spanish. You speak an indigenous language. I met indigenous folks in the border, and then the true power of that story is finding that same community at the border in places like South Carolina and in Georgia, and knowing, as you just said, that some had just gotten there, but some had been there for generations and for decades, right? And it was just so incredible to see, again, the difference in these generations of the younger generation of Mayans, that saw their parents sort of sit in silence in many ways, respond in Spanish when they wanted to respond in Mam or in Cajoal, sort of stay in a corner because they didn't feel like they could be part of a crowd. And then suddenly you have the younger generation of indigenous folks they're very much rejecting that. And in sort of the reddest counties of this country, right, among sort of American flags and Trump flags, and they're choosing to embrace themselves and what it means to be indigenous, what it means to be an immigrant in many different ways, right, and with a lot of pride. And that was very eye-opening for me, because again, from my Cuban American small perspective in Miami, that is not the image of immigrants that I had, and obviously it was flawed.
Well, in places like Chicago, there are people who literally have just arrived, and a very large community on the southeast side that came around the time of the Mexican Revolution. And they're, intermarried with Poles and Czechs and Yugoslavs of various kinds. And they are old Chicago and
Mhm.
kind of part of New Chicago at the same time. In places like Kansas City and central Iowa, which you talk about in the book, there are rural populations that come from rural Latin America and are they don't their American experience is not going to include LA or New York or
Right.
Chicago or Miami. They
Right.
like being country people and they are country people.
Right. And it feels like home. And I think that was, as I was approaching the book and how to do it, the way that I approached the Midwest was recognizing, and again, a flawed recognition, but going into it thinking that the Midwest didn't feel like home to people like me or to immigrants, which was completely incorrect. Right. I went into the Midwest with my own biases and stereotypes about, that the Midwest as this region that was white, and that it was just rural white Americans and blue collar Americans lived there, and it was completely wrong, which is why I called that chapter home, right? Because I allowed myself to sort of navigate that part of the country, not necessarily through characters and through stories, but through culture, right? Understanding how through generations and decades Latinos had been creating culture and building culture. And so in places like Illinois and Chicago, I followed in restaurant owners, right? And Mexicans that had been there, as you said, for generations, to the point that their restaurants had become places of refuge, for the incoming Latinos that were coming. In a place like Wisconsin, I sort of researched that through music, right? Understanding how generations of Latinos for years and have been playing music in a place like Milwaukee, right? At one point it was mariachi, what was dominating, but now it was like hip hop artists and electronic, DJs. And the biggest sort of Latino festival in the country is happening in Wisconsin, which was news to me, and but says a lot. And the same with Iowa. No, it was there. It was through religion, right? How had Latinos sort of found home through religion, and integrated themselves through churches, and that was that was, I'd say, one of the chapters that I enjoyed the most writing, because my conclusion from all that is in the place that I least expected it. I felt most at home, and most embraced and most loved.
I was riding my bicycle across Iowa a
Hmm.
couple of years ago with my son. You ride from the Missouri River to the Mississippi River,
Yeah.
about 500 miles. And we
Wow.
got
It's
into
a
this
lot.
town, and I heard polka music. And I
uh,
love polka music.
okay.
And I said to my son, let's ditch the bikes and find out where this music's coming from. And we head down this alley, and I'm assuming, central Iowa, a lot of those towns were founded by Austrians and Germans. And it was an entirely Mexican combo up on a riser playing polka music, which of course is influenced by the Austrians and Bavarians who moved
Yeah.
to Mexico in the 19th century. And that was one of those moments that you think, oh, that's right.
Right. Right.
The country is changing right underneath my feet. This is terrific. And we also found
Yeah.
fabulous tamales there in this little town in Iowa. Um, but in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, there's this whole new population of Dominicans who,
Hmm.
because it's really expensive to buy a house in New York, they're moving to Eastern Pennsylvania. When I was teaching school at Amherst College, whenever I wanted a taste of home, I would jump in my car and go to Holyoke, the most
Mm.
Puerto Rican city in the mainland United States,
Oh,
50% Puerto
wow.
Rican in central Massachusetts. So it seems like the rest of America, though, is kind of slow to get this. They still think of it as a Miami, New York, Los Angeles
Completely.
thing.
Yeah, and all people have to do is look at the election. I mean, that I think one of the biggest lessons learned from this election is a couple of things. One of them is, if you treat sort of the Latino voting bloc not as Latinos that live in these, the Miamis of the world and Texas and California, if you treat us as a winning strategy throughout the country, people do turn out. And the second idea is that, this famous blue wall in the Midwest wasn't necessarily carried by white voters, right? It wasn't necessarily white voters who gave Joe Biden that margin of victory. It was Black folks in places like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And it was Latinos, and particularly Latinas and younger Latinos, it was them who carried Joe Biden through victory, and who gave the Democrats those margins and those votes that they needed, and to surpass what Trump had done in 2016. And so that to me is one of the biggest, and I hope people understand, right, in the Midwest, that is, again, the last 10 years, the fastest growth of the Latino population has been seen in the South. No, not in Texas, not in Florida, not in California. It's been in the South. From 2010 to 2000 to 2010, the fastest growth was seen in the Midwest. And so we have to rethink, the way that we approach geography and this country. Because once you look at it, the numbers tell you a very, very different story from what the media is trying to tell us.
Marco asks, what are your thoughts on the following? Over the last 40 years, how has the K-12 education system impacted the assimilation, acculturation, and voting participation of Hispanics, Latinos, and Latinx?
I mean, I don't know if I'd have the best answer for that. I think it depends. I think, just if you take a step back, I don't think typically our education system at all does a good job with civic engagement, and with ensuring that young people are civically engaged and politically aware, and understanding that it is, very much a responsibility and a privilege and a right to participate. Right. I don't think that's very much ingrained. I also don't think they do a good job at sort of integrating our history into curriculums. Because that very much informs, when you graduate, and you start understanding sort of your role in this country, a lot of that is based on what you've been told in the classrooms. And if you're sort of neglected in those history classes, you approach college differently, you approach your professions differently. And so that, anyways, that's another thing. But typically also, I think teachers could also do a way better job. I think of one of the things that struck me the most from 2016 was the Southern Poverty Law Center did a study where they found that days after Trump was inaugurated, the amount of bullying had increased in classes, and the amount of discriminatory remarks had increased in classes. And so I think how teachers react in those moments very much impacts the experience of a student. And I don't think we're at a place where everyone is on the same page as to what is, how we can call those moments out, and how we can proceed in a unified way.
In Texas, Arizona, and California in particular, but also in some other places, but in particular, those states have been battlegrounds over how to teach the Spanish Empire history of those places, in the history of those states, and whether or not, for instance, to have Mexican and Mexican American history in the high schools has become a pitched battle in some of these school districts.
What do you think about
in
that?
a way? Well, it's really interesting that there's lots of data to suggest that kids who take those classes have a higher graduation rate and do better in their other classes. So it's a no-brainer, but there's so much fear on the part of state legislatures that there is something inherently anti-American about teaching, for instance, Mexican American history in California, that they would rather pass laws to prevent it from being taught in school rather than taking a chance. Let's find the way to teach it that everybody can live with, and let's get these kids through high school. That's much more important than teaching a patriotic history. Oh, you're afraid I'm going to leave Davy Crockett out? Are you afraid that I'm going to leave Jim Bowie out? Are you afraid that I'm going to leave the Alamo out? I mean, God, let's keep our eyes on the ball here, man. Elizabeth wants to know: are the Latino, Latina interchangeable, or is there some additional meaning implicit in the X when one identifies as Latinx?
I mean, first of all, I think people should obviously identify however they want. No, at the end of the day, and what I am advocating for, and what I think is the power of the X, is that when we think of ourselves collectively, um, as it currently stands, Latinx, as it currently stands, in sort of the language that we have in front of us, is the only word that at least attempts to embrace the 60 million of us, right? And that is if you're a Latina or Latino, but that is also if you are consider yourself, if you're transgender, if you're Afro-Latina, if you're indigenous. In my eyes, it is currently the only word in the dictionary that breaks those stereotypes and that at least starts to include everyone in the conversation. And so what I try and do is, there's many times where I say I'm Latina, but when I talk about us collectively today, I try and use the word X, because at least it again, it is, as I say, it is nothing but an attempt to welcome anyone that has ever felt left out.
Yeah, and the part of the appeal, I guess, is that X in mathematics stands for an unknown. So
Right, exactly.
we're saying here, you fill in your identity, the one that you choose, into that X term.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, I understand the uncertainty. I never claim that it is the best word. There's a lot of problems with the word, but at least it is a conversation starter, right? At least it makes you think of us differently. Feeling uncomfortable is okay, and it's probably something that we all need to do, right? As a community. And at least this word tries to do that. And you can think about it in many different ways. When you think of us, like, instead of thinking, there's this obvious, there's always this urge to think about immigration when they talk about us. Well, the X forces you to break that stereotype, right? Think of different policy issues that affect us. Think of the country in a different way, and think that we belong in a different way. And so for me, I'm using it as sort of an exercise to help me navigate us differently.
I'm glad you brought up belonging, because Americans are surprised when they hear, for instance, that a majority of Latinos were born in the United
Yeah.
States and thus born citizens. There's a sort of permanent foreignness
Yep.
that hangs around our necks, no matter how long we're here.
Even if you're born here, you're right.
Even if you're born here. And sometimes despair about time taking care of that, because people just won't let it go. I mean, here we are, 2020, and you say, well, no, actually, every 30 seconds, a young Latino becomes eligible to vote, and it's going to be that way for the next several years to come. There was a big bulge in the birth rate in the early years of this century and the last years of the just finished one. So a lot of American-born people are joining the ranks of participating citizens in defining this country, and you just better get used to it.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, the sad part of it is that you're right. It's beyond a narrative. It is also reflected in hate crimes in this country. I mean, the anti-Latino hate crimes and hate violence, spiked in 2018 in ways and in higher rates than they had in the previous 10 years. And so, yes, hate crimes don't discriminate against anything. Latinos that are born in this country, young or old, felt that, right? Whether you're Republican or a Democrat, you felt that hate, and no matter how much you try and forget about it, you felt that. And so when I do look at the election, I think it was not so much just about Trump or Biden. I do think there was a statement of young Latinos saying that they belong, right, in Arizona, in places like Texas, even though it didn't go blue. I think a lot of it was driven by this greater statement of we belong in this country, right, and we want to take matters into our own hands, which was also the effect of those votes. It wasn't necessarily that the parties went in there and asked for the votes in the right way. It was that Latinos organized among themselves without any resources in many ways, right? And so that says a lot.
I mean, a guy who was worried about the so-called invasion of Texas jumped in his car and drove 9 hours to El Paso, which El Paso's like 400 and some odd years old. It was a city founded as a trading post between Spaniards and Indians by the pioneer column that came up
Mm,
from Zacatecas with Juan de Oñate,
uh-huh.
who, after all, was married to Montezuma's granddaughter. And, you know, El Paso and Santa Fe and Los Angeles and San Francisco and San Antonio are hundreds of years old. The idea that there's this invasion going on really has to be re-examined a little bit, folks. Know your
But
history.
well, that exactly goes back to your point. You're right. You're absolutely right. If we were to learn that if everyone were to learn that and when they were young, perhaps we'd be saying something very different. But you're absolutely right.
Anonymous wants to ask, I am a Muslim, brown-skinned immigrant woman from Indonesia. I feel like I don't have a space on the table to talk about race,
Mhm.
especially in a way that resonated with me. I do want to start that table, that every race that feel the call to join are welcome to join in the conversation, but I really don't know how to start. I'd love advice and suggestions.
Um, I think I do think we're entering a moment where people are more willing to listen than ever before, as divided as this country is. I think one of the things that at least gives me hope is that people are willing to listen, and also that people are starting to be less scared of using their voice and naming their opinions and what they're saying. And so, I mean, the best piece of advice is the simplest one, which is don't be scared to voice it out. No, one of the to me the best, most interesting stories in the book is when I was actually able to meet the Latina Muslim community, and one of the things that they were scared about, it was being criticized and criminalized by folks like myself, who would look at them and think of them as terrorists, which is what they told me. Think of them in many different ways. And so um, the moment that they sort of broke their stereotypes and explained, um, their opinions and their story, and these were like Mexican immigrants that came here and chose Islam, and it was beautiful, right? And the moment that people start speaking, whether it's whatever it is, um, people listen, right? When you when you make sort of the X personal, and when you give people personal stories, and they're open, and that is one of the things, at least, that gives me hope about this community, is that no matter how divided we are and siloed, um, I do think we have an empathy, and a level of understanding that is greater than we give ourselves credit. And so,
I'm glad she asked that question because in your own background are two nationalities that have a particularly fraught relationship to race, whether
yeah,
it's the largely white
yeah,
refugee, post-revolutionary refugee Cuban community
oh yeah,
that then in later years by more Black Cubans who
of
came to
course,
Florida and came to New York, whether it's Mexico, which has this really odd
yeah,
dichotomy between European immigrants, European immigrants and their descendants, and
hmm,
indigenous people, and a weird level of denial about the existence of African descended Mexicans, uh, the large number of Mexicans who are neither European nor indigenous.
yeah,
Cubans, like other Caribbeans, have a very complicated relationship to slavery and the transportation of millions of
hmm,
people from Africa to the Spanish Empire. Um, Race, but then all of that migrates to a country that is already pretty neurotic about race to begin with.
yeah,
Even if no Latinos came here, the United States would have a pretty weird relationship to race. So
yeah. And that was 80% of this book, and 80-90% of what I'm doing right now is just unlearning everything that I had learned. I mean, that's sort of the core of this. No, the core of what it means to be Latinx is that you have to unlearn what people have been telling us about your own history and about what your skin color means, and understanding, um, that through the years, we've been leaving people behind. No, we've been neglecting and erasing people. And so for me, it was very important to understand where that erasure stemmed from. No, and one of the best conversations was when I went to Mexico, with my own family. And I was there because I wanted to talk to Afro-Mexican activists. And everyone looked at me like I was crazy. They were like, what do you mean? What do you mean there's Afro-Mexicans in Mexico? Like, what are you talking about? Right. And so it was me educating myself. And but you have to allow yourself to do that. No, you have to be able to see your biases. And I'm still learning. But as I said before, I think we are at a moment where people are open to change, particularly younger generations of Latinos. And I see it as my responsibility to have these conversations with my grandfather, right? Who is, as you said, right, like Cuban, but we never grew up around a table of Afro-Cubans, right? And so I have now these conversations with him that I never had before. And to go back to Mexico and have conversations with my grandma and my uncles and my aunts, and tell them about, the activists that I met, right? This idea that, Afro-Mexicans were just included in the Constitution and in the census just 2 years ago. That's all news, right? And so, yeah.
Of all the groups of people that come here in any large numbers, Latinos are the only mixed race people who've come here in large numbers. I mean, lots of people coming from West Africa now, Nigeria and Liberia.
Yeah.
Lots of people have come from the Philippines and China and India.
Yeah.
But Latinos are the only ones who also, in addition to the sort of physical memory of colonialism, bring also a very fraught history with race, paper bag tests and comb tests and "Y tu abuela donde estás?" and all that all that stuff. The whole mess that the United States has had to deal with and work through its system is being added to by having to deal with this, where we actually define a group of people by what they're not. Whenever I read census data and it says non-Hispanic whites, and I think, wow, let me unwrap that package.
But Ray, I want to ask you what because now I want to know what you think about that. You asked me if I sort of saw a Latino vote or a Latino community, if I saw us as one. I'm curious to know what you think, especially after all these years studying us and analyzing us. What do you
I think as a question of tactics, as a question of magnifying power and getting over in America, it would be weird to make yourself smaller and less powerful than you could be. That's the sort of pragmatic way of looking at it. But on another level, I don't think there's that much difference between an underperforming school in the Bronx and an underperforming school in East LA. And I don't think there's that much difference between substandard housing in Hartford, Connecticut, and substandard housing in Southwest Chicago. And I don't think there's that much difference in a bilingual education fight in Miami schools as in Orange County schools. There are transcendent issues that are held in common in all these different places in the country where we live. And underinsurance, for instance, the terrible threat to the health of these people. Underinsurance doesn't feel that different or in Boston or in Houston. And, and the numbers are pretty similar. So why would you say, oh, we're so different and we're not the same people? And don't call me that, when the things that members of these various national groups identify, when you ask them, what are the issues? Work doesn't pay enough. Education isn't reliable as a journey into the middle class. We can't get health insurance. Our jobs are insecure. Why fight and say, okay, but now as a Salvadoran, I'm going to try to fight that battle by myself. As a Puerto Rican, I'm going to try to fight that battle by myself. I don't understand the math behind it. I don't understand the sociology behind it. I don't
Yeah.
get it, but also it's old thinking. Yes, if
Mm,
you came from Santo Domingo, you have an investment in being Dominican that's different from someone who's born in Queens. I
right.
get that. I get that. And I think that my children's generation are going to have a very different idea about the whole thing. Um, your generation, not to
No.
put too fine a point on
No, no, I'm sure. No,
it.
no, yeah, that's honestly, that's the best explanation I've heard. So thank you. You're right.
Well, looking down the road, give me a recipe for the next 10 years. Did you end your book in a hopeful way, given everything that you saw, the good, the bad, and the sometimes ugly? Did you come away from the reporting trip thinking, we're going to be all right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of what I'm fixated on two things, and continuing to sort of cover and follow that younger generation, right? That as we talked about before, that is creating a new path for themselves, and making a statement in the way that they just did in 2020. I'm interested in following that story. But more than anything, as usual, I want to know in this election who were once again the people that were left out. Um, which is what I was fixated on in 2016, which is what prompted me to write this book. But I still want to know that 30-40% that didn't show up to vote, is that the X, right? Or is that still the Afro-Latinos that didn't feel part of us? Is that still the indigenous folks that were never, reached because people were just reaching out in English or in Spanish? Are those the trans folks and queer folks? And so I want to continue focusing on the people that were left out, and see if it is in fact the younger generation of Latinos that starts to pull them in. But I see more hope than anything. I'm interested to see how this generation holds this administration accountable, what that looks like, and then just to continue following our us in positions of power, which I think is happening in front of us right now.
My guest is Paola Ramos. Her book is called Finding Latinx: In Search of the Voices, Redefining Latino Identity. It was great that you could join us today. Good luck on your reporting trip.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks so much for having me.
To those of you who listened in today, thanks a lot. We hope you enjoyed today's program. To learn more, we encourage you to pick up the book, Finding Latinx. Please join World Affairs tonight for the Global Citizens Awards, our annual fundraising event. This year, we're celebrating individuals who have taken bold action on climate change, and in doing so, have helped increase awareness of the issue and move the conversation forward. Make sure to RSVP on our website. Have a great rest of your week, and thanks again for joining us today. Take care.